as most gay people have, I had the experience of my parents not being real happy that I was gay. And so there was a period of time where I didn't go to church. For me, it was a brief period of time. For many people, it could have been decades, long stretch of time. For me, it was really just a summer. My family had kicked me out of the house. I was finishing graduate school upon finding out that I was a gay person. And so I had been, am I telling the truth? So that's the part I'm going to have to figure out. Am I telling the truth of the chronology? I'm trying to figure out where I need to go back and figure out those places. I was in graduate school at University of Houston, and towards the end of that term, on Mother's Day of that year, Saturday before that Sunday, I had a date. And it was one of the first dates I'd really had with someone of the same gender. It was all fairly new for me. It was 1983, and I was 23 years old, and I went on this date, and the person's name's Mark, was a member here at Berean Church. And so the date went well. It's one of those dates that lasted till the next morning, and the next morning was Sunday, and the next morning was church. And so he and a couple of his friends had been coming to this church, to Berean United Methodist Church, and so I went with them to church here. And it was a little fearful because I had just experienced my parents saying I wasn't good enough to go to church. And so I'd been away from church about half a year at that point in time. I wasn't sure I believed them that the church wasn't for me anymore, but I had stayed away. And so coming here on that Sunday morning, I didn't go far in. I tried to sit in the back pew, but the back pew was occupied. And so I sat on the pew in front of the back pew. And I watched in the service the whole time for the moment when I was going to be rejected, or they were going to say something bad that meant that I would not be welcome in the space. And so I watched for it the whole time. I made it through the scripture and made it through the sermon, all fine. Communion was held. I didn't know it was every Sunday. And my Methodist church I grew up in, that wasn't the case. So I thought, Communion Sunday. And so I went forward to take communion, and that was extremely meaningful to me. The person whose name was Jean was serving that day, and it just felt like this huge cup that came at me at the rail where we knelt down, and just abundance and acceptance. But I still wasn't sure. So I went back and sat next to the last pew again, and was ready to beat it out at the end of the service. That's why people sit at the back. You can leave without people catching you. And as I was ready to leave, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, a strong hand grab my shoulder, and I looked. It was actually a wrinkled old hand, but it was very strong. And as I looked behind me, there's this grandmotherly type person who said, "You boys be good and come back next Sunday." And that's all the blessing I needed, was a grandmother's blessing to, "You boys be good and come back next Sunday." And I found out later her name was Eva Toon, and she and Ruby and others of what was the United Methodist Women's Circle. They had circles which were small groups called the Toon Circle. And the women of the Toon Circle had decided they were going to fill up the back pew of the church, because they'd seen all these young people come in and leave real fast. And they were old enough they couldn't catch them in time. But if they sat on the back pew, they could catch them before these young people ran out of the church. And so it changed my life. I don't know if I would have come back to church, at least not soon, if it hadn't been that Eva and her crew was sitting on the back pew because they couldn't walk fast enough, grabbed me by the shoulder before even the end of service. She might have been able to tell I was going to run, and said, "You boys be good, come back next Sunday." So the people I came with really weren't regular attenders. They didn't come back next Sunday, but I did, and came regularly ever since that point in time. So that was Mother's Day, 1983, and I was very thankful for finding this church. Didn't know the church's history or the church's story. I knew it was Methodist, and I knew I grew up in the United Methodist Church. And so that made it easy to come in the doorway. I found out later, I found out later when I had been here for a while and we did some history and some other stuff. I found out later that in the not early 70s, the same time our denomination was choosing to put in negative language about gay people, that they're incompatible with Christian teaching, same time period, this church passed an administrative council resolution that said we will welcome the hippies and the homosexuals. Back at the same time the denomination was going one direction, this church was saying, this is what's on our doorsteps. We have gay people in this neighborhood, and I guess there were hippies in this neighborhood at that time too, not as many as when I got here, but we will welcome the hippies and the homosexuals. If you go back, you can find that in the notes. And so Eva, in her 80s, and the rest of that row were a part of that. They were the people who had a couple of decades earlier passed the resolution, we will welcome the hippies and the homosexuals, and made a space that was ready for when I came to visit. The church was fairly empty. You could sit on a pew and not have anyone near you at all. There was probably about 45 people in attendance that day, maybe 50. So lots of bare wood on the pews in that time period. But there was space enough for me, and I felt warm and welcome being here that day. It didn't take long to be involved. It wasn't that day, but within the first couple of Sundays I was here, the pastor was Ron Pogue at the time, and his wife's name was Gay, and they had 2 boys. And one of their boys was autistic, or is autistic, and Matthew, I believe. And somehow, not but a couple of Sundays in, I ended up taking care of Matthew for an afternoon. Pastors always have church meetings and, they have their children with them and all this stuff, and so it was just really fast. I got a crash course on how to take care of Matthew, who at the time was elementary school age, autistic child. And then I was needed, and so it was a place where I could belong and I could serve as well. Very, very important then summer of my life, being present here. At the end of the summer, they were starting a new covenant group. And so I don't know how many they had, 1, 2, not many, because there weren't that many people participating. But they formed groups of 8 people to meet weekly for whatever study they were doing. And Annette Jones was the associate pastor at that time, and she was going to be facilitating one of these small groups. And so I signed up for it, and was a part of the covenant group then for maybe the next 3 or 4 years of my life here at Resurrection. It might change who was in it. Annette wasn't here that whole time. Ron wasn't here that whole time. He had become Episcopalian, shifted and was doing that work. But that small group weekly work reminded me of John Wesley's cell groups. We held each other accountable, probably not the way that was on John Wesley's lists of did you drink this week or did you smoke this week. That wasn't the kind of list we used. But it was more of how are you doing this week? How's your soul this week? What's your spirit like? What's life like? And so we would use some study, I don't think it mattered, in order to get connected to one another in our faith with each other. Some of the people in that group, to this day, Lyndon Johnson, Shannon Warren, Joy Clayton, John McAllen, who's the first person of this church that died of AIDS that we know of. And others too, Roz Rainbolt, were in that group. And I know where most of them are this day. Greg Yarborough, I know where most of them still are. We may not be in contact weekly, but when Roz Rainbolt was marrying her partner, she said my girlfriend Mary, when she finally was getting married to her this year legally, after 40-something years of being together, they called and asked me to do the wedding. They live near Austin these days. But so those people are still out there doing good things. Greg Yarborough has died of AIDS. John McAllen, who was in the group, he was the first person in a hospital in a bed that we met around and prayed for. And I don't know, it wasn't AIDS yet. It was probably GRID at the time. And I'm not sure that we had any answers for what it was. It's just that he was dying, and he lived just a block across the street in the guest house of one of the old members, Willa Mae Trappy. And I don't know if anyone here knows Willa Mae, but she was one of those 80-year-olds that had lived in the neighborhood forever and welcomed us in. And if you lived in Willa Mae's guest house, which was like a garage apartment above the garage, you were going to end up getting invited to come to church. And I think she badgered John into finally coming to Resurrection because he wasn't a church person. And she just kept after him. He said, well, I have a hard time waking up. Well, I'll wake you up. Well, I'll need to eat something. Well, I'll make you breakfast. Well, so Willa Mae was one of those Willa Mae Trappy was one of those people who just kept after him until he came to church and became a part of the church. And was one of those first people we buried. But he found a home. He found a home and a place that he could be a part of in that small group. Later, when Willa Mae died, in 90, I don't know how old she was when she died, she had out-survived everyone. She had out-survived her husband, she had out-survived her friends. She had just had a good long life. And she didn't have any pallbearers for her funeral. So we had some meeting on, I don't remember what it was, but I told the story of her getting John here. She had a whole church of pallbearers because we were the people that she welcomed in. Even if it wasn't each of us personally, her actions towards John knew the people of the young gay and lesbian people of this church at the time knew we were here because of that generation. So she had more than enough pallbearers for her, even though her generation was gone. Gratitude and things for that witness to us. She was also fun. As the elder generation here was dying in their 80s and 90s, and this younger generation that was primarily people who were gay and lesbian and their allies in the congregation, there was good energy around being able to be welcomed in a church. In that time in our history, there was not that many welcoming churches around. And the denomination of the Methodist Church was not welcoming, and is still not by policy. But this congregation said they were going to welcome the hippies and the homosexuals in 1968 or 72, and they meant it. And so we were lucky to have this oasis in Houston. And so two of the people who were excited were two guys named Dale and Doug, who always planned fabulous events for us, and they're the ones who ended up painting the sanctuary and making everything beautiful, even though it was very old at the time. They were able to turn things around as far as making it look pretty. And so one of the things they would do is throw fundraisers. And so they were throwing a fundraiser. It was a pool party, and it was at Dr. Ed Cordray's house. And so we had church announcements on Sunday morning, and Willa Mae was in the congregation when Doug Luark got up there and said, and we're having a pool party, and we're going to have adult beverages, I think is the way he put it. And he said, and we're going to have Methodist margaritas, and we're going to have Catholic margaritas, and we're going to have beer. And he was so just excited and jubilant about this event and raising money for the church. And he hadn't grown up in the Methodist church, so he didn't know that was not the thing you're supposed to say in front of the congregation on a Sunday morning. Hopefully we've grown past that. And Willa Mae was in the congregation, and she kind of toddled as she walked slowly. And so after church, she walked down there to the front to Doug, and I thought, oh, I don't know what she's going to say to him, because she's of that generation wasn't acceptable. And so I said, what did she say to you, to Doug afterwards? And he said, she said, my husband, when he was alive, he'd love to have a beer out by the pool. And she had given him $5 to go buy a six-pack, so that there'd be one six-pack at the pool party that Willa Mae donated to them. So that spirit of just embracing and being a part of the changes that were going on here she shared that with us, and she empowered us to do it. And she wasn't the only one. Frances Bickley, a teacher, been here forever, was another one of those. Over time, I got involved in teaching Sunday school here, sometimes on a cycle for either the teenagers or the older classes that were there. There had been 3 of them, and I can't remember all the names, but they all started with F. And so by the time I started teaching them, it was just the FFF class. And it was Friendship and Fidelis, and I don't know what the other one was. But they had merged together as they had died off and gotten smaller. And one Sunday I looked in there, and it was all women, all gray-headed, all 80 or 90. And so I thought, and I kind of felt sorry for them. I said, they've all lost their husbands. You know, they're alone. And so I kind of, the widows, it wasn't the widows class, but so I said this to one of them, Frances. I said, Frances, you know, I just kind of felt sad about this, that this was all the widows from the church meeting on Sunday mornings, and I'm glad I'm going to come and teach you. And she said, oh, Troy, there's never been any men in this class. We were the young mothers class. And, and I thought, okay, so I was invited in as a teacher, but I would have not been invited in as a member because they, for decades, had been the young mothers class. And even though they were Fidelis class now, they knew they were the young mothers class. And there had never been any men in that class, so come on in and teach. We're fine. Don't worry about us, we're fine. Just one of the great people that this church benefited from having as a part of the church. So that covenant group with Annette Jones and those people participating, the excitement of having a home that was church. Sometimes we would go out to a local club called Brazos River Bottom, which is a country western club that no longer exists, and we would go on the night that was steak night. And so our little Bible group, our covenant group, would go on steak night. And we would enjoy ourselves so much, people would come up and ask, well, who are you? And y'all know each other, and where are you from? And we would say, church. And Lyndon started calling it our evangelism escapade. And so he said, we need to plan more evangelism escapades. Because we had people come to church because they saw the love and the community of the group on steak night. And what's that about? And decided they would come and check out Bering Memorial United Methodist Church. And I was just, Lyndon was an over-the-top person, and so he said, evangelistic escapade. And so, and he also called himself the gay bride of Christ. And many other quotes from Lyndon over the years. He owned a hair salon here in Houston, and was very surprised that the columns didn't fall down when he made his way into church on a Christmas Eve service, partially intoxicated, but found his way in his mink fur coat or whatever, and sat wherever he sat, and was just amazed that the building still stayed standing while he was there in church, and ended up coming until he died, also of it. But it was a compelling small group that kept us engaged. Those are most of my early years. So I was a youngster, 24, 25, 26. Was a teacher at a local business school, and church was important to me. Very, very important to me. John died in January of 1986, John McCallum. That was the one we stood around the bed and prayed for. So I'd known him 2 years at that time, 2.5 years from being a part of a group with him. And then we started seeing other people get sick, and started paying attention. Our church treasurer, Cheryl Lee Morton, got very, very ill. And we just didn't have language for what was happening. We didn't know really what it was. And there were no real treatments at the time. AZT hadn't come out as a medication yet. And so we just walked with people as they were getting ill. And more people in the church knew Shelby, since he'd been an active member and was the treasurer and all those things. And I think his death actually spurred more of the social groups around HIV and AIDS and starting the ministries around that. he was one of those people that found out when that he was going to die, decided to go buy the fastest, most sexy car he could and enjoy himself. And then he didn't die as fast as he thought he was going to. So he had to start paying some of the bills off on some of those. But it was 2 months to 2 years. 2 years was a long life with HIV at that time. And so it could have been the next month, and he didn't know. And so we started first a support group here on Wednesday nights. And the first group had one family attend, the Bingham family, David and his sister Donna Price came, and that's how we started our HIV work. Then other things happened very quickly after that group began. But you could do that because it didn't take any money. You could open the room and have volunteers facilitate and peer facilitate, because it was ministry, and people were wanting to give time to that. And so I wasn't there at the very first meeting, but I think I was there at the second meeting, and stayed involved with that over the next, as long as I was here at Bering. The group grew and grew and grew. The crisis was so big that community formed without much effort. People needed one another, and so we had Buddhist participants, Muslim participants, all sorts of Christian participants. We had our agnostics and our atheists, but the evening, which started with a meal together, and then went into small support groups where people shared, and then ended with communion. We had every faith and non-faith represented at communion. It was one of the most holy times I know of. And the crisis allowed us the opportunity to be, we could have chosen not to be in community. We could have chosen to keep the walls up and the barriers up. But it crossed all those borders, crossed all those boundaries back then. And I think sometimes an outside enemy can force that kind of cohesion. And we certainly made ministry out of that time and that moment of what was going on. The meals were always, 1 week you could have all desserts, and 1 week you could have all entrees, because there wasn't like a you bring this. People just brought what they could bring after work, or could make that day. There's one man named George, I could remember how he and his partner were doing, depending on if his deviled eggs were runny or not, because he brought deviled eggs every week, and they could either be really firm and stiff, or they could be like running all over the plate. I said, okay, how are you doing this week, George? Because of how his deviled eggs were. And lots of people became, we had meetings where we had 140, was the largest I remember. But for a period of time, it was regularly 100 to 120 people on Wednesday nights for that community. Small church, it was a church in itself that met. And that's how Mary Parker became involved with her son Kelly. That's how a lot of the people became involved, eventually with the church. Wanting to see what was going on upstairs, as we were having this small church in the basement downstairs, eventually making their way upstairs on a Sunday morning to find out what was happening. And in that time period is when I knew that I needed to answer the call into ministry. The largeness of the epidemic was such that, and there really weren't a lot of people responding at that time. This church did what a lot of people were afraid of doing. The only reason the dental clinic is still on site here is because originally we couldn't get insurance for it somewhere else. And so, because we're looking for a building that was more of a medical building where you could have a dental clinic in it, and we were going to lease it, and insurance would not cover an HIV dental clinic. And so the insurance we first had for the dental clinic at the beginning was provided by the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, because they insured the church, and no one else would. But that started half a day, 1 day a week, and it's just grown into what it is now, with a volunteer dentist. Half day, 1 day a week with a volunteer dentist, who's still the director. Mark Nichols has been around from the very, very beginning of that program. But so early in my life, I had felt called into ministry. But the gay, I knew the gay thing and the call thing at the same time. I felt called and attraction to men like in the same week. And so I knew I couldn't be both, at least in a United Methodist context. And so I just didn't pay attention to either for a long time. And so I'd come out as a gay person, and then the epidemic hit. And I remembered that, yes, I felt called into ministry, and went back to look at that again. And being in this community allowed that to be a possibility, allowed it to be something I could even consider. If I'd been somewhere else, it might not have ever even been able to consider that that was a possibility. And so there was a local seminary here that I attended while still helping with the Wednesday night group. And I quit my job. And luckily my partner was able to support both of us while I was going back to school. So I quit my job, sold the townhouse that I was living in, used that money to pay for tuition and books for the next couple of years. And my partner covered everything else that was needed. And during that, and it was a conservative seminary, so it was always good to come back here on Sunday morning and know that that wasn't the only way people approached God. So this church gave me resources to be able to stay in seminary that whole time. And I was out there about my work with HIV and AIDS, and so it brought up a lot of challenges for Houston Graduate School of Theology, which was an evangelical Quaker founded seminary. That's true. Evangelical Quakers are a real thing, and they're conservative. So I was ordained here at church at Bering. Oh, geez. I can't believe my identity has shifted that much, because I was saying Bering all the time for a long time when I'm at Resurrection. And so I can't believe that's become the norm. So I had a United Methodist pastor who was a psychiatrist also do my supervision as a psychotherapist. So I got licensed as a psychotherapist and ordained while I was here at Bering. When the ordination time came, we knew that I could not be ordained as a United Methodist person because I was in a relationship that I wasn't going to give up, and the church would not allow that to happen. This congregation was still very committed to having a pastor who was gay serving our HIV persons in the hospitals. Because I was originally going to do it as a psychotherapist, just pastoral care. And the leadership of the congregation said, no, you need to be ordained. You need to be a pastor. We need a pastor visiting our members and the people from the support group in the hospital. And so that was a part of, because I interestingly, while I was in seminary, I took all the courses needed for ordination, even though my plan had been to just be a therapist, right? But I ended up taking all the courses. I think God was involved in that. And then I finished with my MDiv, and the congregation, along with me, looked for how that could happen. And there was a small group called the Orthodox Catholic Church that ordained gay people. And they would appoint me to serve here. They ordained gay people, and they would appoint me to serve at a Methodist church. And they still exist, and my ordaining bishop, I still am in contact with Carlos Florido. And so on that day, it came about, Don Sinclair was the pastor of Bering at the time, and Don walked me down the aisle and gave me away, essentially, to be ordained in the Orthodox Catholic Church and serve here at Bering. There's a part of the service, and some people were skeptical. Who are these people? They were worried for me, and so when it came to time of the service, it was sort of like, this is a real church, these are real credentials, this is authentic faith, and yes, they will support even this gay community by supporting one of their priests to be a part of the staff here at Bering. And so they came in with all the pomp and splendor of robes and all the doodah incense, which we didn't use here because Harold and Juanita McConnell, some of our 80-year-olds, were allergic to it. So we were high church, but we couldn't use incense because we didn't want Harold to have to run out of the church while we were using. We used everything else except for that. You could not tell this was a Methodist church in the days Ron Pope were here, because it was very, very high liturgical church, which was real important for people who needed healing. It kind of wrapped them in tradition, and they were able to feel God's love as a part of it. So it wasn't a big jump for the ordination service as it was to happen here. For our people, it's like, oh, we do this on Sunday mornings. This is how we worship. And so Don gave me away, and there's a part of the service where you have to lay face down on the floor as the congregation prays for you, and it's like submitting to God's will and the blessings of the people at that time. So I'm at the front of the church, between the front pew and the little dais there, and face down with my arms stretched out like this, and they're saying prayers and stuff, and I couldn't see exactly what was going on, but out the corner of my eye, the sacristy is over to the side where we keep everything, and and there was a fire while I was down on the ground like this, and so luckily I couldn't see what was happening over there, but one of our members, Dan Calloway, who had in his life been a Roman Catholic altar boy, said he knew how to do a censer. He knew how to, get the coal lit and how to do all this stuff. And so for this one Sunday, this one event, we were going to use it. And so he had prepared. He was very prepared to make it happen. And so he couldn't find incense, the briquettes. And so he found regular charcoal briquettes. And in a censer this big, he had piled 3 regular charcoal briquettes. And he had doused them with lighter fluid. And so when they were coming down the aisle with it, it was smoking after they put the little incense on it. And then there's a point in the service where it was hot, too hot for him. When they used it to bless the table, the priests were holding it way away from them. And then they gave it back to Dan. Dan disappears into the sacristy to cool it down. And so actually Jim Kryling, Dan Calloway did that, and then this is how it happened. Dan Calloway had the incense, and Jim Kryling was, who we call Trixie affectionately, had been a banner bearer for the day. And so he was sitting in the chair outside the sacristy with the banner behind him. That's where Jim was sitting. And so Dan, and this is told to me because I was busy, Dan opens the door and says, "Help!" And like in a stage whisper that everyone in the church could hear, and a third of the church could see when he opened the door that there was a blazing fire in the sacristy. And he had taken the hot thing in and set it on the countertop. And the lighter fluid he had used so well to go into the briquettes earlier had spilled on the countertop. And so he set it down, and immediately flames went up. And so Trixie heard him say help, and Trixie runs in there. The only thing he could find is this little bitty container of sand that we use for different times of the year, and he threw it, and it immediately went out. And Trixie said there are these flaky things all coming around, and so we were worried. We went later to see what had burned. The cabinet, how much damage, the cabinets, the walls, and that's also where we stored all of our banners and all of our all these different fabric things. And nothing was damaged. Nothing was damaged. Did you know this story? Nothing was damaged. And so we couldn't figure out what was going on. Why was nothing damaged? Because it freaked out the congregation. Ed Cordray was at the back saying, "Please don't let this old church burn down." I said, "Please, let's not let Ed Cordray have a heart attack." Because it is an old church, and it shouldn't be on fire. What occurred was that what burned, we found out later, on the back splash over the counter were these written instructions that were there from a person I used to affectionately call the worship commander. His name was Bob McKee. And the worship commander had all these do-nots on this sheet of paper, about how to open the cabinets, where things went back, how to wash things, and all this stuff. And that's what burned. And so I find it very meaningful to me that as the story unfolded, that what got burned while I was down, face down on the ground in the sanctuary, was the "do it this way or else" sheet. It got burned away because this church was doing it in a way no one else had done before. They were ordaining an out gay man in a relationship to be their pastor. And in that moment, that piece of paper was taken away. And nothing else was harmed. And you can call a miracle whatever you want. Lighter fluid and charcoal briquettes, I think, can make a miracle. And someone who really thought they knew how to be an altar boy. But so that happened on my ordination, and I started work here part-time at the end of school, and then graduated and started work, and then went to work here full-time after that. It was a crazy time. People look back at my schedule back then, and they said, "You shouldn't have been doing that." I said, "I know, but it was just a crazy time. There was so much need. People were dying, and I would have 30 clients a week and do 4 or 5 groups and do a retreat on the weekend, and it was just, you just didn't ever go home." But that was how it fed me, and at the same time, it was necessary. And this church and the volunteers were right there with me all along the way of making sure people knew they were loved and making sure people knew they had a home. And that was, and I wrote it down so I would remember. So I came in 1983, Mother's Day, and I was ordained on December 8th, 1991. And so from 83 to 91, I had gone to seminary and then come back and started work, become a staff member of the church. And HIV pushed that. HIV really provoked that because it was horrible what wasn't happening elsewhere and how people were being treated. Some churches were refusing the common cup for communion, and we had the common cup. But you had your choice here. You had common cup and you had little cups. And we were one, because they were afraid. They didn't know how HIV was transmitted, and they were concerned about infection, and so we never took the common cup away. We researched it, we solved transmission, and we knew that was just fear. And so we never took that away. Ron Pogue had a vision for this space that it would be a spiritual retreat when he was here. And this was pre-HIV. And so the last couple of years he was here, he was really working at trying to make the big building on the other side of the sanctuary into a retreat center. The second floor was going to be kind of cells where people could sleep, and then they were going to have these retreats throughout the week. And so that was his vision for what happened. And he really was the first to publicly welcome lesbian and gay people here at the church, to the point that he was written up in the Chronicle. There was a story about him being the pastor in Montrose. And I don't know if you know the story or not, but during that time the church was shot at when Ron was here. And so when I did new membership classes, when I was a pastor here, I would take people out to look at the sign in the front, diagonal on the corner, facing the intersection of Mulberry and Herald. And if you look behind it, and I don't think they fixed it, if they have, it's gone, but there were, the backside was metal, and so there were 3 dented spots where you could see where bullets had pushed the metal out that made and so this, and I would take the new members out there to where it's exploring and said, okay, so this is the kind of church you're going. You may get shot at. Be careful, because we're serious about living the gospel of Christ, but you may be shot at. And that plate came off the back of that sign. I hope they kept it somewhere, because that's what was the result of being open and being inclusive and telling the world that you were being open and inclusive brought about that hate to shoot out that sign and some other damage to the church building back then. So that was meaningful to me, and I think meaningful to others that Ron took that risk. And then right after Don Sinclair came, HIV came, and the immediate shift became service and helping people. And Don had been active in the civil rights movement, and he was just the right person at the right time to come in and help us be about that social justice work. And the church grew. We were losing people every week, but the church grew. We'd have weeks where funerals where we did 3 people one Holy Week, this is Holy Week, you're interviewing me on Holy Week, we had 3 funeral services. And I remember like 20 of us in the sanctuary trying to dust pews and move them around because something was wrong with a leak somewhere. And it was just craziness trying to have the 3 funerals, and then also all the Holy Week services and get everything accomplished that needed to be. And I've never had a more clear sense of ministry than then. There was no question about what needed to be done. It was right before you. There was just no question about what you need to do to respond. You were at the hospital, or you were at a funeral, or you were teaching people how to not be afraid. It was just crazy times, and this church answered those times in a way other churches were not able to do it. So I appreciate that being a real important part of who I am today. I'm not who I am today without stories of being here at Barry and the work with HIV AIDS and the people who loved us and being invited in by Eva Toomey. I wouldn't be the person I am without all of that good work that happened. As time went on, and we were able to look our heads up a little bit outside of the HIV AIDS epidemic, because we were doing other justice work too, but we were just overwhelmed by the need for that. But we started to do other justice things within the United Methodist Church. We became a reconciling congregation, and I don't remember the year of that, but we did become a reconciling congregation. I was on the writing team to write our statement with some others, and we didn't have much pushback, but there was a little bit, because no matter how long you've been in a loving environment, if you were raised as a person who was told they weren't good, or who they were at the core of their being was bad, it takes a while to get through all of that stuff. And so we had people who were worried about us becoming a reconciling congregation, that would be unwelcoming of straight people, that we were saying we're openly welcoming of gay people. There were people, and these were gay people, who were worried about that. And so we went through the process. Didn't take us a long time, but we need to address those concerns and those fears of folks about what that meant. And some people felt like it was political, and certainly it is. But the gospel's political. Jesus was political, and so it wasn't anything contrary to our faith or our understanding of the gospel. And so we met with Don Sinclair over in the parsonage several times, made draft statements, and we started out, the choir became the first reconciling part, and then a Sunday school class, and then after the different number of groups became reconciling, we took it to the whole church for a vote to become a reconciling congregation, and to say so publicly. It's interesting, we were a little arrogant, because I think part of the resistance was, well, we're doing all this already, why do we need them? We don't need them. We're doing this, but they brought us further out of the closet. We were doing all the things we were doing, but the Reconciling Ministries Network brought us into a network of hundreds of churches that were welcoming of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And we needed them, but we couldn't see that we needed them. It was just sort of like, we can do it on our own. Maybe that's Texas, I don't know, but we just resisted for a while until we became a part, and then we started offering people to the National Board of Reconciling Ministries Network. Several of our folks have served on that board. And then eventually I became a staff member there. But part of what that gave us the strength to do was to think of how we might be engaged in other ways. And when Marilyn Meeker-Williams came to be the pastor here, that was, Don had been here, was it 10 years, even 10 years. And we were, I would say we were dry, if I had to name it spiritually. Not out of any sense of not being fed, but just exhausted. And with the social work and the justice and all the pieces that we were doing. And Marilyn brought in this deep sense of spirituality. She'd been raised in the Friends Church, and that deep inner light that she brought with her. The church grew enormously in the first 2 years that Marilyn was here. But she brought that spirit that actually was healing for people who'd been doing this work a long time. And she's brought with her also a deep commitment to justice. And so, whereas I would always marry people of same gender or opposite gender couples while I was here, Don Sinclair's approach, I just did that, didn't I? Don Sinclair's approach of that was, Troy is doing another one of those services I'm not supposed to know about. So Don would let the church be used. If you want to do a wedding, just put it on the calendar as a worship service. And so we put it on the calendar as a worship service. So I was marrying gay people here in our sanctuary a long time ago. And when Marilyn came, that shifted to, instead of like nobody knowing about it or that sort of thing, it shifted to, we won't do what we will only do services we can for everyone. And so it shifted to a statement of justice that said, since our denomination doesn't allow us to do weddings for gay couples, we won't do any weddings in the church buildings by Methodist pastors. I wasn't a Methodist pastor. And so the way we got around it was I would do the weddings, and I would do them on the street in front of the church. And then we would come inside the church for communion. And we still could have been brought up on charges before the bishop of the church. We still could, she could have lost her credentials. It was a risk to do this, even as we did it. We were very careful and strategic about how we did it. And we did our first wedding on the streets, and I looked up the date, August 27th, 1999. And it was for a lesbian couple who'd been together 25 years. And they had learned that it was okay for them to get married in Bible study. We were doing disciple Bible study, about 3 or 4 sections each year, and it was very popular. It's a 9-month Bible study where you go through the Old and the New Testament in rapid succession, and you meet each week for 2.5 hours and work it out. So by the time this lesbian, it was in a class I was facilitating, by the time we got to the end of the Gospels in that 9-month curriculum, they looked at each other and said, well, can't we get married? And it was the Bible study that they'd been in for all those months that made them first ask the question, we've been together this long, will the church marry us? And isn't God blessing that? Isn't God blessing our love, blessing our children? And shouldn't that be okay? But they hadn't even considered the question until they'd been in Bible study that long. And so we planned the service. We had it out front of the church. There were about 10 or 12 United Methodist pastors that came to be witnesses that stood on the front steps. They couldn't participate in the wedding itself, but they wanted to show their support for the wedding. And Marilyn was there with as many colleagues as she could gather around her there. Don Sinclair was there as well. And we did the wedding in the street, 1 inch over the center point. Because in the city of Houston, you're responsible for your property halfway into the street. And so we knew when the bishop would be called and all that other source, did you do it on church property? We didn't want any chance that it could be said it was done on church property. And so we put the couple and me 1 inch over the middle of the street. And we are told that when it was brought to the bishop's attention, the bishop said, they went 1 inch over the middle of the street. Actually said back to the person, so that no charges ultimately were brought against Marilyn or the church for us doing that wedding. It was an important time for the congregation to say what they believe, to say who they are. Was it political? Yes. But being about love and caring for people in this world is political. It makes you do things that other people may not like or hope that you might not do, but it's your job to speak up for them. And so that was in 1999 that we did that service. And it was joyful. The street was packed. We had hundreds of chairs in the street. People participated. We processed everything from the altar in the church outside. We had the banners, we had candlesticks, we had everything, the cross. So it had come out on the other side of the street, and then when the wedding was over, we processed everything inside. The Bible, the cross, the banners all went inside. The whole congregation went inside, and then we all took communion together. And the couple was the first couple to take communion, and Marilyn presided over communion. Because she said, if they're going to bring me up on charges and kick me out of the church for offering people communion, she said, that's a battle I can fight. And she never got brought up on charges for that. But some of pastors are still worried about what can they do. they can do a lot. Because praying for people, offering communion to people, so many services, reading scripture. Make the church take us down for reading the Bible. I'd like to see that case. It's just not going to happen. But we were smart. So this church had good lawyers, good United Methodists, and people able to make a plan so that we could carve out what we needed to do in ministry. We said that we were following the letter of the law while following the spirit of the gospel. And I believe that's true. We followed the letter of United Methodist doctrine and law while following the spirit of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what made that powerful, and I believe that's what made that happen so well. Randy Hody was the first executive director of Bering Community Service Foundation. And he was a whirlwind, making things happen, getting things done. And we didn't really know how to raise money for HIV. We were getting a few grants. We had a part-time dental clinic, we had part-time dementia care, we had part-time assistance through funding, and then we were doing some counseling work. And we just didn't know quite what to do for all this. So we decided we would throw a party. And so we figured, how are we going to throw a party? And started step by step by step. So it was called an Evening of Hope. And someone brought the Alley Theater online, and so we ended up getting a donated production of an Edward Albee play, and so for that night. And so it had to be more than that, and so somehow, Randy Hody or someone had connection to a local socialite, Carolyn Farr, and she came on board with us. And so she said, oh yeah, well, how do we make this big? Because that's how our mind worked, was how do we make this big? And so we reserved Tranquility Park outside of the alley. And so we had roller skaters delivering things to people in the park. We had just amazing thing. People were in evening gowns. Our women had never had so much makeup on in their life as they went to this place. They looked just like the socialites that were there. The outcome of it was, so I got to dance with Cloris Leachman. She had a parrot on her shoulder because someone had parrots that they brought, and she was a guest, and so I actually danced with her with a parrot on her shoulder. Interesting for a pastor to be dancing with an actress with a parrot. But we were seen then as a force to be reckoned with. We were the first organization in Harris County to raise over $100,000 for work with HIV and AIDS, and I think it was like 120. But that event, play donated, park donated, people coming in and giving money and dressing up, was our first effort at fundraising that we had done. From an organization that had just been it was a year old, not even, barely I think, and Esther Hauser and Frank Staggs, members of this congregation, wrote the first check that opened the bank account for Bering Community Services Foundation. And it's just, the need was so dramatic that things just took off to be able to support that. But Carolyn was able to bring a group of people into discussion around HIV and AIDS that had not been at the table at all. This is before Rock Hudson died. This is before any of this sort of stuff where people would talk about it. And so I appreciate that she took the risk to take us on and to raise money for this in that way. And in Houston, that made a difference for the church and for the foundation. Originally, the church had 2/3 of the members of the board of the foundation, but they had a vision that it was supposed to be bigger than the church. So they always had community members on the board. And over time, that switched. It switched from 1/3 of the members' community to half of the members' community to merging with another organization. But it's still, each step of the way was, how is this of service? And how is this helping? And how is this doing what it needs to do? So we actually created something that's now been merged to a larger organization that may not even have the Bering name in it after a while. But if it wasn't for the faithfulness of this community being here for all those years ahead of time to make it a welcome space for people like me and those others like me, it wouldn't be doing what it's doing now. It just wouldn't be in existence. So I do want to tell you that story about that first fundraiser and that first check. And I served on the board until I was hired as staff, I was on the board for the foundation for a little while too. Reconciling Ministries Network is a network of churches that are United Methodist that seek to work for equality for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities in the life of the church. Currently, our church policy says that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, which is a joke. Don Sinclair used to say that. He's never seen anything more compatible. But so Reconciling Ministries lobbies bishops and boards of the church, and also does grassroots church organizing with local congregations to group by group and also by network, and invite people to be more welcoming. And in our denomination, that's been a healing moment for many of our churches and regions. And worldwide, we're a worldwide church, so there's a variety of opinions about homosexuality. Overseas, in Africa and other places, very conservative. Here in the U.S., West Coast, they would have been marrying gay people legally decades ago. So we have such a breadth, but the church is so big, it's just not moving fast. And they've been aware that we are a colonial church, the Methodist Church. It's a U.S. church that went out beyond the U.S. And so we're aware that where we've built churches outside the U.S., we don't want to tell them what their truth is. We need to engage them and have relationships with them and have them be moved along. So that commitment sacrifices currently the possibility to have a majority church support reconciling for the whole church. It's, I think it could be done, but the church is going to have a lot of courage to be able to do that. And General Conference is coming up, so maybe they'll do something this time around. When I went to Reconciling Ministries Network, this church saved them. We did not know it, but our Christmas collection always went to 3 Justice or Compassionate Ministries. So Search for the Homeless was usually one of our favorites, and Reconciling Ministries Network was one of our favorites too. And if people designated where they wanted to go, it went to that charity. And then if they didn't designate it, at that time I had the choice to where it went. And so I sent it all to Reconciling Ministries Network that year. Well, that turned out to be a little under $10,000. And we didn't know that January, when we sent the check to them, that they didn't know how to make payroll that month. And so our gifts from our Christmas offering that year helped Reconciling Ministries Network make payroll that month. It was a shoestring budget and operation. And when I went, and it's grown and grown and grown now, but this church was a part of helping them make it through a hard and difficult time, and I don't know that people here know that. I knew Reconciling knew that, because I know they knew what position and what shape they were in at that time. I want to show you this, and then I think I'm done with everything I need to say. But after I became a pastor, I started to write in this book the names of the services I would do, of people who had died, and also services I would do if I baptized someone, services I would do if it was a wedding. And so when I knew I was coming to talk to you today, I grabbed this to bring it over here because it's part of our history together. And I would stuff leaflets in it, and this isn't all of them, I have a whole folder, but originally I would stuff leaflets in here, bulletins from the services of people who had died. And even a wedding bulletin, if there was one in here. We just did many, many more funerals than we did anything else. But as I was looking for it to just try and remember how that ministry started, look at the first page, and I did a funeral and a wedding on December 13th, 1991. The funeral was for Larry Upp. The wedding was for Paul Apperson and Jamie Cisneros. That was 4 days after I was ordained. Both a wedding and a funeral on the same day. As time went on, I buried that whole family. Paul died and Jamie died, and we actually helped their son, find support after they died. But it started just on that same day with both in the same day, and then many, 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 many funerals as went by. There's a point in time when it got to be too much, and I didn't realize this till looking back at it, I stopped writing down. And that was Christmas of '95. And so that was just 4 years. I couldn't write them down anymore. I still would keep the folder and put it in a pile that I still have. But some of them have faces of people who've gone. Others are just the planning sheet of what the service was like. But I think it's important to share that I'm not the only one that experienced that. There's a place in time where we got overwhelmed, and we trusted in God, and we got back up again, and we kept going. So we might have stopped writing in a book, or we might stop doing things the way we had been doing, but the people of this congregation kept working and moving and listening to God, and saved many, many, many